Welcome to Belief Busters Podcast, where we change the world one belief at a time. True transformation happens when we question if the beliefs we hold are of truth, or simply someone else's belief that we have internalized as our own. I'm your host, Rev. Cherie Taylor-Jones, and I'm glad you could join us on the journey. Today we have Zaire with us, and I'm really excited to talk to him. He is a minister who has 36 years. He's retired, but he's been working with interfaith ministries. And he's discerned that now more than ever, people are painfully divided politically, religiously, and culturally. And yet there is a commonality in our faith traditions that can help us turn away from that polarization and create a greater sense of community in which our differences are honored. And he's written a book called The Peacemaker's Faith, which is a multifaith reflection to deepen your spirituality. And he says this about the book: The Peacemaker's Path brings together wisdom from the world's major religions like the Bahá'í, Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, Jainism, Judaism, Native American spirituality, Sikhism, Taoism, and Zoroastrianism, showing that we have much more in common than what divides us. So I am super excited to have Jerry on our podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. Namaste. Good to be here with you.
Really good to have this kind of conversation, because I think, my heart lies in it's all God. And so, regardless of what the faith tradition is, if we are striving to connect to the truth of who we are and consciousness and the divine, we are in the right and perfect path.
I agree 100%. As we get in alignment with the divine and within ourselves and beyond, we're in harmony.
And one of the topics that we agreed to talk about today was the idea that what thought we have represents who we truly are. And I think it's just human nature to kind of have that concept. But is that true?
Well, it is. And what's interesting, and most of us don't realize, that in we have 20% of our brain is the conscious brain, but 80% is the unconscious. And we get programmed within the first 7 years of our life. As a baby and as a young child, we're like a sponge. We take it all in, and it starts to program who we are. And our unconscious is the default. And so if you grew up maybe with a sense of some judgmentalness or some harshness or some sense of not affirming yourself or not feeling affirmed, that can affect you as you live out your life as an adult. Or if you feel affirmed and loved and cared for, then that can be your default. But what happens, because society puts such a kind of a level of telling us we're not good enough. We're never good enough. And so we feel this, I need to exercise more. I'm not skinny enough. I'm not good looking enough. Society tells you that. Then sometimes some religious traditions have kind of imposed a sense of guilt or shame. Or maybe we felt that from our parents, that we have to achieve, we have to be better. And so when you get programmed in that way, those thoughts come into our when we're thinking, those thoughts are there that really affect how we feel about ourselves and see the world.
Yeah, that's really true. And I remember in my spiritual journey, I would have thoughts like those, like you're not good enough, nobody cares what you're thinking, nobody wants to support you, those kinds of thoughts. If you were only tall enough, short enough, thin enough, smart enough, those were kind of the thoughts that went through my mind. And I came to realize that those thoughts weren't really my own thoughts, but the conditioning that I've gone through, the programming, as you just mentioned.
Yeah, I think so. And, I call it the critic voice. And if you describe the critic voice, at least in my life, because I grew up kind of with a very driven, kind of authoritarian background, and religion was very legalistic, and be fearful and afraid.
Right.
So that critic voice inside of me was always, don't be lazy. You need to do better. You can do more. The critic voice was always worried. What's going to happen next? Don't trust people. If you took the personality of the critic voice and put that into a person beside you and you described it, you'd say, well, this person beside me, the critic, is anxious, they're judgmental, they're perfectionistic, they're very hard on themselves. Well, you would never want a person like that around you.
Right.
But because those are your thoughts inside your own head, you listen to them.
Yes.
And we listen to them rent free. It's like they just stay there. And I was the same way with you. I realized just because I had those thoughts, I thought I needed to listen to them.
Yes.
And then I realized I can change my own pattern of thought and what I really do believe.
Can you take us maybe a little bit through the process of how did you awaken to that inner critic? Didn't define who you were, wasn't even really you, but some programming. And then how did you kind of start shifting that to changing those thoughts?
Well, and I have a whole chapter about loving yourself in my book. And it really was, as a Christian, I was taught to love God and then love your neighbor as yourself. Mm-hmm. So I was focusing on loving others. We didn't do a lot about loving ourselves. And of course, Jesus and all the great teachers of the faith talk about self-care. You have to love and honor yourself before you do that with any others. But I would, when people would give me a compliment, I'd go, oh, thank you, but, oh, it wasn't really that good. Right. Oh, it wasn't much, and yes. Because I was always taught to be not too prideful. So I would push away those affirmations when inside I yearned for them, but I didn't think I was worthy. So as I started hearing the critic voice and realizing, well, that was just my parents' voice, or that was the church, or that was society. And the voice that God wanted me to hear, that I saw over, that I heard in Jesus' teachings, and then I heard in all of the faith, great teachers, yes. Loving yourself, knowing you are a child of God and good. So then I started going, take that affirmation in. And if I would get some card where somebody, said, oh, it was good to see you, and you're a dear friend of mine, I started saving those cards so that when I started feeling a little down on myself, I could remind myself, Jerry, in fact, you need to love yourself as much as people love you.
Beautiful.
So that began the process of starting to be aware that when those critic voice came in, I would say, I'm not going to let you stay there. Just go. Okay. My critic voice would say, oh, Jerry, why should you write this book? Nobody's going to read this book. What do you think you're doing? And I just would go, that's not even true. You don't even know that. Why are you even letting that go? I'm writing the book because I feel God has inspired me, has given me this. I'm going to write it because I believe in it. And then you would hear that voice inside that almost says, you're doing well, Jerry. You can do this. So it's shifting to hearing the quiet voice of God. And here's an interesting point that, I was shocked to hear this, but you think about it, we have so many thoughts during the day. They say we have like 60,000 thoughts. Mindless thoughts, everything. And they say almost 80% of those thoughts are negative. Just subtle ways like, oh, you better hurry up, better get there. Oh, something's happening. Oh, why is that person doing that? Little negative thoughts. Well, when you have those negative thoughts all the time, that has to bring you down. And so again, it's saying, let those thoughts go. They're there. You can't force them not to come in, but let them just flow through. Don't let them stay rent-free.
And I love the idea of really giving ourselves permission to question what we hear internally. We are so often on automatic pilot that just kind of sits with us, and we don't give ourselves permission to ask the questions like, where did I get that thought? Whose voice am I hearing? Those are really powerful tools just in that little questioning to awaken to the truth of who we are, right?
Yes, and that's what I talk about, the unconscious. That's the default. When we're conscious, we're more aware. We're maybe a little more processing it. But when we get tired, when we get, overwhelmed, it's easy to go to the default, and then we just let that in. And that's why the more we're aware of our feelings, the more we're aware of what's going on, because we all get depressed, we all get anxious or worried, then it's to say, okay, what is it that I'm worried about? And can I do something about it? Well, not right now, I'm at home. Okay, so just let that go for right now. And some of that is watching how much I don't watch very much TV anymore, because when I watch the news, I hear all this negative
Yes.
fighting and compassion, and I go, I don't even want to hear that, right?
Right. Yeah.
So it's what do we want to put into our mind? And that's why meditation and breathing, having a chance to clear your mind, listening to music that gives you that sense of joy, being with people, those are the things that get the chemicals. And now this is a scientific thing. We have our chemicals, serotonin, dopamine. We have these chemicals that get produced that make us feel better when we have love, compassion, caring.
Yep.
One of the things, when I start to feel a little, our bodies go through a biorhythm. We're up and we're down. Sometimes when we're down, and I'll start making a list of things I'm grateful for, things that are blessings. Then I start listing, gosh, I have a wife that hasn't kicked me out of the house. I have a house that I live in. I have a car. Yes. I'm healthy. I have people who love me. Well, now when I start listing things I have, rather than focusing on the things I don't have, it shifts me and brings me into a whole better state.
Yeah, it does. It's, we hear these little cliches about, well, meditate, or do yoga, or stay still, or write the gratitude list. And I know some of our listeners may think, oh, I've heard all of that before. And the reason that they've heard this before is because it works.
It does work. I mean, I've never had somebody tell me, I made a list of 10 things that I had been blessed with, and then told me, I feel worse than when I started that. This doesn't happen.
No, it
right?
doesn't. No,
Because
it doesn't.
love is at the center of the universe. Love is the field. It's the universal consciousness. Love is that which brings us into oneness with the divine. And so the more of love that we can carry forth in our life. Now we have challenges. We have some difficulty things. We might lose a job. And so I'm not saying that life is easy, but then it's about what will we focus on rather than, and what do we want to manifest and have our thoughts create? Because it is true, our thoughts become our actions become our character becomes our destiny. It starts to manifest, and it begins with thought. Thought is actually just light. They're a frequency, a vibration, a light vibration that goes in a frequency. And the more of that vibration of goodness and love that we let inside of us, we get connected to the vibration of the universe.
Yeah, and you bring up a really good point when you talk about life still happens. There is the loss of job, there is the car accident, there are those things that happen in the world that we're living. And, for us to think it only happens to us and that we're a target of something or some kind of negativity keeps us in that rut.
Well, feeling stuck, I think, our feeling in bondage to our past.
Yes.
One of the best things that I've been able to start to do, and it's taken me some time, but to not take things personally. So that when somebody's upset and they maybe lash out at me or they give me criticism. Now I might listen to the criticism, but a lot of times when they do it with intensity, they're angry or, they're upset. Why didn't you do that better? It says a lot more about them than about me. And I used to take that all in. Oh, they're upset. Oh, I must be terrible. I must be all these things, right? Well, I don't do that now. You're upset. So tell me about why you're upset, and what's going on with you that makes you want to lash out, because nobody deserves to be lashed out or angry. And before that used to hook me, and then I just would go down that rabbit hole. But now I realize just because somebody's angry or frustrated, that's what they're dealing with. If I stay centered and love myself, know myself, trust myself, believe in myself, that I can feel confident that I don't need to get into the defensive mode and try to banter back and forth.
Right.
But that's taken some years. So, I don't want to say that's easy.
No, it's
because
not.
when I was in my 20s and even my 30s, I wasn't as secure in myself. I didn't learn about loving myself. So I would say to your listeners, the first thing you can do is focus on finding ways that you love yourself and care about yourself. What are the things that you affirm about yourself and that you want to grow into? Maybe you find yourself more anxious and you want to have more inner peace, to focus on that. And then to be gentle with yourself, to cut yourself a little slack. We're harder on ourselves than we are on other people a lot of times.
Yeah, I think there's some truth in that. Most of us in the Western culture have been raised in puritanical work ethics, and about being productive at every moment. And if we aren't, then we're slackers.
Yeah.
And so it's really about learning that is a myth that doesn't feed our souls, and it doesn't give us the bandwidth that we need to be able to deal with life on life's terms. Because what we know is that there's so many things that are going to happen. Yes, there's good. Yes, there are things that we may consider bad because we don't understand the greater concept of what's happening. But ours really is to learn to how do we stay centered and within our knowing while life is happening. So being able to respond to life as opposed to reacting, right?
Oh, I think that's so good, because as we can be aware of the moment we're in and not worry about in the future, but just be present and be aware of our own feelings and emotions, what I'm feeling. So when I'm in a conference or I'm at work and maybe some people are arguing and I can feel my emotions start to get a little threatened, I'm now aware of that, and I can think a little more before I just blurt it out, and what I can do. And that's, again, part of that. The default for me, my father was so driven. He was type A. He had a nervous breakdown when he was 52 because he could never slow down.
Yes.
So he was always saying to me, you're lazy, you have to do more. Yes. Well, he felt that about himself. He felt he was lazy because his father told him. Right. Finally, at some point in my 30s, my wife pointed out to me after we got married, I would only finally relax when I was physically exhausted. I could give myself permission to finally take a day off when I was exhausted. And then I come to realize I'm not lazy at all.
Yes.
Where did that come from? Well, I know exactly where it came from.
Yes.
And I just finally, and my father kind of had tried to say something to me one point. And I said, hey, I'm not going to put up with that. And, he looked at me like, well, okay. I mean, it's hard to stand up to those people who've been authority figures for us.
Yep.
But there's something about just because we were taught something doesn't make it true.
Wow, that's a powerful statement right there. Just because we were taught something doesn't make it true. Yeah.
I was taught that everybody was going to go to hell if people didn't believe like my church and the way we were. And inside of me, I went, I just don't buy it that 3/4 of the world, just because they're not Christian are going to go to hell. If
Right.
God is love, there's something more. I couldn't put it into terms, but I knew it, and I just never bought it. And I asked the question, and that began my own journey to be able to be involved and get to know people of other faiths, because I just wanted to expand my understanding of God.
Yes. Yes. It's a powerful step in our awakening when we choose to question the tenets of a religion, the tenets of our family systems, the tenets of our upbringing. That's a real defining moment in our lives. And often when we have that defining moment, it feels so uncomfortable and chaotic that it creates a lot of anxiety and angst within us.
It does.
Do you have any tips to support people when that awakening does happen and those feelings that come up?
Well, I think one of the things that's been helpful for me is writing things out, because when I think about them, I can't put it out there. So it's good for me to write things so I can see it. So when I can write it out, my feelings, my questions, even my questions to God. I used to have conversations with God, but I really felt like this was what I was asking God. Then I just would kind of meditate, and I don't know if it was Jerry's own conscience saying back to me, or if it was the divine giving me kind of a direction,
Mm-hmm.
but it was having some clarity. So that was very helpful to me, writing. The other thing that was helpful is finding some people who were good, positive people that I could talk with, that I could have conversations, that I could have the conversation with about, well, what do you believe about God, or about love, or about health? The other thing that's a little bit that I would say as people begin the awakening is to look at what what do you feel stuck in? What do you feel that you want to let go of to live into a fuller sense of harmony and goodness? What are some of those things? And then to look at, where do those come from? A lot of times, some of those things have happened in our life because we've been wounded, we've been shamed, or something has happened that we have had a hard time forgiving others, or forgiving ourselves, or being able to let that go.
The other end of the spectrum is, what about those folks that have been on the path for some time and they feel like enlightenment or awakening or spirituality means they don't have any problems in the world anymore?
Wow. I don't know. Are there people like that?
There are.
Well, there comes a sense of that, we come to some, I'm at a much better place in my own inner peace. I don't get frustrated as much. I don't get that. But, we all have deadlines. We all have things to go with. And that's just part of our spiritual journey. And that's when I say to people, it's the process. And when my wife got divorced, for a couple of years, she really beat up on herself. We got married. She had been married for 13 years, got divorced, and she felt such a failure about being divorced. And I said, you did the best you could.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't go into that marriage thinking you're going to get divorced right away.
Right.
You did it. You had two beautiful children. Your children now, you have grandchildren. And yes, there were some difficult things that happened in those 13 years, but you also grew from that. And I would have never met you if you hadn't got divorced. So, there's part of the journey we're on. I remember getting fired from a job and feeling like a failure and feeling like it was the worst thing. But I learned so much more about myself as I got fired, and it helped me to evaluate, what really did I want to do, because my heart wasn't in that job. And that's when I started looking toward being in ministry, working with other people in relationships. And so it really is that journey. And that's the part about giving ourselves some grace, giving ourselves forgiveness, some sense of care that God would give to us and that we could give to ourselves.
As we're on that spiritual journey for a while, sometimes that sense of feeling stuck. You know, we wonder if we're on the right path, as opposed to kind of turning that around a little bit and going, what's the lesson here? What's in this for me? What am I being called to grow or let go of that I haven't been willing to do before?
And I really do believe that as, I was very frustrated in ministry and I was ready to leave. And all of a sudden I get this letter from this congregation. I didn't even have my papers out. And this congregation had heard about kind of the things I was doing with the interfaith and more progressive reach in the community. And the things that where I was at, they didn't really want, they didn't buy into. Now here was this, and I literally had thrown it into the waste paper basket because I was like, oh, I'm just done with it all.
Yes.
And then this friend of mine said, Jerry, you better at least open the door. I mean, don't close the door. Yes. And so when I called up and it just, I think to myself, what would I've done if my friend hadn't said, Jerry, get that letter out of the waste paper basket? And thank goodness he did. And thank goodness that I listened to that and opened the door. And I do think, though, that God will help us find our way. Maybe it doesn't work out like we think it should, but we'll get there.
Amen. That's a great story, because so often we have in our minds what it should look like, what the outcome must be for us to be labeled successful or on the spiritual path or in our own knowing and wisdom. And sometimes we just need to get out of our way and let other people support us.
Oh, and I think your image of success is so good. That in the Critic Voice, being successful, what does it mean? Even as a minister, ministers would get together and they'd say, how many people do you have in your church? Yes. How many members do you have? Like somehow, if I have more members, I'm a better minister. I'm more successful.
Yes.
And we even buy into that. How many listeners do you have on your podcast compared to somebody else? Like somehow my self-worth is wrapped up into my productivity.
Yes.
And I've had to reframe to say, okay, if 100 people buy my book and that's it, that's okay. Because I've written this book as my offering, that those 100 people, the great story of this is Reverend Stanley, his last name is Stanley. He was a minister who was over in India. He got to be friends with Gandhi. So Gandhi was influenced by Reverend Stanley in the teachings of Jesus on nonviolence. So the publishers wanted him to write this book about his relationship to Gandhi and his journey in India. Well, it came out in the 1950s, the civil rights movement, the bombed. I mean, nobody bought the book. Nobody wanted to hear about civil rights in the 1950s.
Yes.
But Martin Luther King Jr. was working on his doctorate, and he was in the library researching. And because he was interested in Gandhi, he read this book that Reverend Stanley had written. And in it, he marked, this is it. It was that defining understanding of Reverend Stanley talking with Gandhi about this nonviolence that shaped Martin Luther King Jr.'s whole sense of how we will speak to resistance and to the injustice in the world, but in nonviolent ways. And I always think, that Reverend Stanley in the hereafter, in heaven or beyond this, maybe is finally going, okay, maybe only 10 people read the book, but at least one person who helped change the world.
Yes.
Right?
I love that. That's a beautiful way to end our conversation. Thank you, Jerry. So before you go, can you tell us, do you work with individuals? Is it the book that's your passion right now? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm really with the book. I'm doing speaking engagements or Zoom meetings with people, and my website, jerryzehr.com, has a way of people contact me. They can get my book on my website or go to Amazon. The Peacemaker's Path, Multifaith Reflections to Deepen Your Spirituality. And it is 40 days. It's kind of a devotional that you can read one devotion a day. And I've had 6 themes. So there's 6 chapters, themes in the book. And each day I have my reflection, then I have scriptures from all of the faith traditions, and then a prayer from a different faith leader, and then some things to reflect on. So it's very accessible. I didn't want to write a book of theology. I wanted to write a book that people could read to enhance and work with themselves. The themes in the book are walking the enlightened path, loving yourself, loving others, karma, the power of prayer, and then the quest for peace.
Thank you so much for going on this conversation with me. It was, it's something that we're all dealing with today, even more now than any other time, I think, on our planet. And it's so great to have this conversation with you.
Well, and I thank you. As we talked before the podcast, sometimes, those of us who are trying to build ways of peace, and a lot of your listeners, because they're in the same mindset. And sometimes we get frustrated because it feels like, things are very divided, but there is healing that's happening. There is a sense of, if we remember the 1950s, when Catholics and Protestants couldn't even marry, black and whites couldn't be together.
Yep.
We've made progress. Yes, it's a difficult time right now because we're in change and people are fearful. But I believe that we are having a spiritual awakening. We are having a new way that our world is coming together through Zoom, through technology. And I think we're seeing some wonderful power of healing that will come. So I pray for that and for your listeners to pray together for this healing for our world.
And so to Belief Busters Posse, I'm so glad that you joined us for this conversation. And as you're listening, I hope that you hear that, ministers, people who are doing this spiritual awakening work, we have to take our own advice. Use the tools. Take that time to love ourselves, to self-care, to listen, to be with the divine, and rejuvenate again to do what is ours to do in the world. So I'm hoping that you continue the journey with us as we call you to live the life that you truly deserve. If you are enjoying these conversations about assessing your belief systems and how to transform outdated beliefs, then please subscribe and give us a positive review. To support this podcast and its transformative work, you can also become a sponsor for as little as $5 a month. You can reach Rev Cherie at info@beliefbusterspodcast.org. To continue on this journey of evolution, you can also get my book, Turning Your Why into Why Not, at Amazon or any other bookstores, which gives you practical tools to do this work. See you next time on the flip side.